Tonight, we begin with a simple question that's going to haunt you for the next hour. What if I told you that everything you think you know about World War I is a comfortable lie, designed to make the unfathomable seem heroic? Picture this. You're 18 years old, fresh off the farm in rural England, and 3 months ago, the most dangerous thing you'd ever done was climb a ladder to fix the barn roof. Now you're standing in a trench that's equal parts mud, human waste, and decomposing flesh. Holding a rifle that weighs more than your little sister, waiting for a whistle that will send you sprinting across open ground toward machine guns that can fire 600 rounds per minute. Let's be brutally clear about something right from the start. The version of World War I you've seen in movies, the one with noble sacrifice and glorious charges and meaningful death. That's not the war we're about to experience together. That's the sanitized, Hollywood-approved, made-for-television version that lets us sleep at night. The real Western Front was a 4-year-long industrial meat grinder that took an entire generation of young men and processed them into statistics. And tonight, you're going to understand exactly why your soft, modern, centrally heated self wouldn't survive a single day in those trenches. Forget the war poetry you read in high school. Forget the romantic notion of soldiers bonding in the face of adversity. Forget every single thing you think you know about the Great War. Because we're about to strip away a century of mythology and drop you directly into the most viscerally horrifying sustained combat experience in human history. You think you understand suffering because your Wi-Fi went out for 3 hours last week. You think you know what cold feels like because you had to scrape ice off your windshield this morning. You believe you comprehend fear because you watched a scary movie with the lights off. Let me introduce you to a reality so utterly alien to your modern existence that your brain will actively resist accepting it as something that actually happened to real human beings. This isn't ancient history. This isn't medieval torture. This is your great-great-grandfather's war. And it was so incomprehensibly awful that an entire generation of survivors simply refused to talk about it for the rest of their lives. We're going to ease into this together. Because if I hit you with the full horror right away, you'd click away and go back to scrolling through videos of cats doing funny things. And honestly, I wouldn't blame you. But stick with me. Because understanding what these men endured isn't just about history. It's about recognizing the staggering gap between the soft, cushioned world we inhabit and the brutal reality that existed just a few generations ago. By the time we're done tonight, you're going to look at your comfortable bed, your clean bathroom, your refrigerator full of food, and you're going to feel a kind of gratitude you've never experienced before. You're also going to understand why the survivors of the Western Front came home fundamentally broken in ways that no amount of parades or medals could ever fix. So let's begin your first day in the trenches. And remember, this isn't fiction. This isn't exaggeration. This is exactly what millions of young men experienced between 1914 and 1918. And we're going to walk through it step by step until you understand why the term shell shock was invented specifically for this war. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe so you'll always know when a new one is uploaded. And I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Your journey to hell begins not with violence, but with bureaucracy. And somehow that makes it worse because it means the horror you're about to experience is organized, systematized, approved by men in offices who will never set foot in the mud. You've enlisted, Probably because your friends enlisted. Probably because every poster in town shows a stern-faced soldier pointing at you with the caption, "Your country needs you." Probably because the girls in your village have started handing out white feathers to young men not in uniform, marking them as cowards. The recruitment office smells like sweat and paper and desperate enthusiasm, filled with boys who think war is going to be like the adventure stories they read, who believe they'll be home by Christmas, who have absolutely no concept of what a machine gun does to human tissue. The recruiter doesn't ask many questions because the British Army needs bodies more than it needs qualified soldiers. So if you're breathing in roughly the right age, congratulations, you're in. They measure you, barely, and discover you're 5 feet 6 inches tall and weigh 140 pounds. Which means you're about to carry equipment that weighs nearly 70 pounds through mud that can swallow a man whole. Nobody mentions this part. They give you a uniform that doesn't fit, boots that will give you blisters within the first mile of marching, and a haircut so short you feel the cold air on your scalp for the first time in your life. Then comes the training, and this is where you get your first hint that maybe, just maybe, this isn't going to be the glorious adventure you imagined. Your drill sergeant is a man who survived the first years of the war, which means he's seen things that have burned away any patience for incompetent recruits. And he expresses his displeasure by screaming directly into your face from a distance of approximately 2 inches until you can taste his breakfast. You learn to march in formation, which seems pointless until you realize that on the Western Front, everything operates on rigid schedules because that's the only way to move hundreds of thousands of men through a network of trenches without total chaos. You learn to fix a bayonet to your rifle, and during this lesson, you discover that your hands shake when you think about actually using it. About driving 17 inches of sharpened steel into another human being's torso. You learn to salute officers, to maintain your equipment, to follow orders without question, and most importantly, you learn that your life as an individual has ended and you are now simply a component in a massive military machine that values you approximately as much as it values a spare button. The training lasts weeks, maybe months if you're lucky, and during this time you're still in England, still technically safe, still able to imagine that when you finally ship out to France, it won't be as bad as the rumors suggest. But the rumors are everywhere, whispered by the soldiers who've come back missing limbs or eyes or sanity. And these men don't talk about glory. They don't talk about honor. They talk about rats the size of cats and gas attacks that melt your lungs and artillery barrages that last for days without stopping. You tell yourself they're exaggerating because the alternative is accepting that you volunteered to walk directly into a nightmare from which there is no waking up. The crossing to France happens on a transport ship that's absolutely packed with soldiers. All of you crammed below deck in conditions that would make a factory farm look spacious. And within an hour of departure, half the men are vomiting into buckets or over the side or just onto the floor because the English Channel is rougher than it looks and none of you are sailors. You're trying to keep your breakfast down while standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of other terrified boys pretending to be men. And the smell is absolutely spectacular. A rich bouquet of vomit, sweat, diesel fuel, and the underlying stench of fear that no amount of propaganda can mask. Some guys are singing patriotic songs, trying to keep spirits up. But their voices sound hollow and forced, like whistling past a graveyard, except the graveyard is still miles away, and you're marching directly toward it with full knowledge of what's waiting there. The officers are up on deck, naturally, breathing fresh air and probably having a civilized meal. While you're down here wondering if you're going to die from seasickness before you even reach France, which would actually be the merciful option, but you don't know that yet. When you finally arrive at the port, the first thing that hits you is the noise, the constant rumbling like distant thunder that never stops. And someone explains that's the artillery, the big guns firing day and night along the Western Front, which is still dozens of miles away, but apparently loud enough to be heard from the coast. This is the moment when the reality starts to sink in. When you understand that this isn't a training exercise, this isn't a parade. This is actually happening, and there's no going back, because desertion means a firing squad. And anyway, where would you go? You're in a foreign country surrounded by military police who exist specifically to catch soldiers trying to run away from their duty. They march you off the ship and into a staging area, where you'll spend anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, waiting for your turn to head up to the front lines. And during this time, you're subjected to more training, more drills, more lectures from officers who seem to believe that if they just explain the battle plan one more time, somehow it will make sense why sending waves of men across open ground into machine gun fire is considered sound military strategy. You clean your rifle obsessively because it's the one thing you can control. The one piece of equipment that might actually keep you alive. Though you're starting to suspect that survival has less to do with skill or preparation and more to do with random chance. With being in the right place when a shell lands instead of the wrong place. With ducking at the right moment or zagging when you should have zigged. The food is terrible. Bland stew and hard bread that tastes like sawdust. But you eat it anyway because you're burning through calories with all the marching and drilling, and you have no idea when your next meal might come once you reach the trenches. At night, you try to sleep in a tent with 20 other men, listening to them snore and fart and occasionally cry out in their sleep. And you wonder what nightmares they're having. Whether they're worse than the reality you're about to face or somehow prophetic. Their subconscious minds already processing the horror that their waking brains refuse to accept. The march to the front lines begins in the middle of the night because apparently that's when most military operations happen. When you're already exhausted and disoriented and barely capable of putting one foot in front of the other without falling over. They wake you from whatever restless sleep you manage to achieve by shouting and banging on metal pots. And you have maybe 10 minutes to get your kit together. Use the latrine if you can push your way through the crowd, and fall into formation with your unit. Your pack weighs 70 pounds, distributed across your shoulders and back in a way that seems specifically designed to cause maximum discomfort. And this pack contains everything you'll need to survive in the trenches. Ammunition, rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, extra socks if you're lucky, and various other items that the Army has determined are essential, even though half of them you'll never use. The rifle adds another 10 pounds, and by the time you're fully loaded, you're carrying nearly half your body weight in equipment, while trying to march in formation down roads that are either ankle-deep in mud or rutted and frozen depending on the season. The march lasts hours, and during this time you discover muscles you didn't know you had as they begin screaming in protest. And the straps of your pack dig into your shoulders until you can't feel your arms, and your feet start to blister inside boots that were never properly broken in because there wasn't time for such luxuries. You march past villages that have been shelled into rubble, past farmers' fields that are now just churned mud and shell craters, past refugee columns of French civilians fleeing in the opposite direction with whatever possessions they could carry. And the look in their eyes tells you everything you need to know about where you're headed. The sound of artillery gets louder with every mile, changing from a distant rumble to distinct explosions that you can feel in your chest. And occasionally you see flashes of light on the horizon, like heat lightning. Except it's December. And that's not lightning. That's high explosive shells detonating with enough force to vaporize anyone unfortunate enough to be standing nearby. Nobody talks during the march because you're too tired and too scared, and anyway, what is there to say? The officers ride horses while you walk, which seems unfair until you realize that when the shells start falling, those horses make excellent targets, and being on foot might actually be safer. You pass supply convoys heading toward the front, trucks and wagons loaded with ammunition and food and medical supplies. And you pass ambulances heading away from the front, and you try very hard not to look at what's visible through the back windows of those ambulances. Try not to see the blood-stained bandages and the men who are screaming, or the men who are too quiet because the screaming has stopped. The sky begins to lighten toward dawn, which means you've been marching for something like 6 hours. And just when you think your legs are going to give out completely, you see it. The trench system. A network of zigzagging ditches carved into the earth. And this is going to be your home for the foreseeable future, assuming you survive long enough for the word home to have any meaning. Descending into the trench for the first time is like walking down into your own grave. Except graves are quieter and probably smell better. And at least in a grave, you'd have the dignity of being dead already instead of waiting for it to happen. The communication trench is narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, with walls of sandbags and mud that rise 7 feet on either side. And the path leads downward at an angle that makes you feel like you're burrowing into the earth itself. The first thing that hits you, even before you're fully in the trench, is the smell. And nothing in your civilian life has prepared you for this particular combination of odors. Human waste, rotting sandbags, stagnant water, decomposing bodies that haven't been recovered, wet wool, cordite from recent shelling, the sharp chemical tang of chlorine gas that hasn't quite dissipated. And underneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of death that you can taste in the back of your throat. You want to gag, you want to turn around and run. But there are men behind you and men in front of you, and nowhere to go except forward into the fetid darkness. The duckboards under your feet, wooden planks laid across the bottom of the trench to keep you out of the mud, are slippery and unstable. And within your first 5 steps, you nearly fall because someone has spilled something unidentifiable on them. Or maybe it's just the accumulated slime of thousands of boots passing over them day after day. The walls of the trench are reinforced with sandbags that are slowly rotting in the perpetual dampness. And occasionally, you see a sandbag that's burst open, spilling its contents, except the contents don't look like sand anymore. They look like a mixture of mud and things you'd rather not identify. There are men already in the trench, veterans who've been here for weeks or months. And you can tell them apart from the new arrivals because they move with the defeated shuffle of the damned. Their uniforms are caked with dried mud that's become a permanent second skin. And their eyes have that 1,000-yard stare that suggests they're not entirely present in their own bodies anymore. They don't welcome you, don't acknowledge your arrival beyond a cursory glance. Because what's the point in making friends with someone who might be dead by tomorrow? The trench zigzags every few yards, a design meant to prevent enemy fire from enfilading the entire length. But it also means you can never see more than 20 feet in any direction, can never get a sense of where you are in the larger network of trenches that stretches for hundreds of miles along the Western Front. Above you, at ground level, is a wooden fire step built into the wall, and on that fire step stands a sentry with his rifle, watching no man's land through a gap between sandbags. And you realize with a sick feeling that soon that will be you, standing there waiting for a German sniper to put a bullet through your head. Rats scurry along the bottom of the trench. And these aren't the cute little field mice you might have seen back on the farm. These are enormous creatures the size of cats, bloated from feeding on God knows what. And they're not afraid of you. They're not afraid of anything. Because in the trenches, the rats are winning the evolutionary arms race, and they know it. Your first night in the trench is when you discover that sleep, that basic human necessity you've taken for granted your entire life, has become a luxury you can no longer afford. And the reasons for this are numerous, and all of them are terrible. First, there's nowhere to actually lie down unless you count the dugouts carved into the trench walls. And these dugouts are tiny spaces barely big enough for two men sitting upright, let alone lying flat. And they're already occupied by men who have seniority through the simple fact of having survived longer than you. So you're going to spend your first night standing or sitting on the fire step or leaning against the muddy wall, trying not to think about what's soaked into that wall over the months of occupation. And every position is uncomfortable in a unique and special way that makes you long for the previous position you were complaining about 10 minutes ago. Second, it's cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and sets up permanent residence there. And your uniform is designed for durability, not warmth. And it's wet from the perpetual dampness of the trench. And wet fabric conducts heat away from your body about 20 times faster than dry fabric, which means you're shivering uncontrollably within the first hour. And by dawn, you'll have forgotten what it feels like to be warm. Third, there's the noise, because the Western Front never sleeps even if you can't. And all night long there's the crack of rifle fire as snipers take pot shots at anything that moves. The rattle of machine guns firing random bursts to discourage nighttime raids. The boom of artillery both distant and close. The occasional scream of a star shell being fired into the air to illuminate no man's land in harsh magnesium light that turns everything into stark shadows, makes you freeze in whatever position you're in, because movement means death. Fourth, there are the rats. And at night they become bold, crawling over your boots and up your legs if you're sitting still. And you can hear them squeaking and fighting over scraps, and sometimes over things that aren't scraps. And occasionally, you feel one run across your hand or your neck, and you have to suppress the urge to scream because screaming draws attention, and attention draws sniper fire. Fifth, there's the smell, which somehow gets worse at night when your other senses are diminished, and you become acutely aware that you're standing in what is essentially an open sewer containing the waste of thousands of men. And your nose tries to shut down in self-defense, but your brain won't let it. So you spend the night breathing through your mouth and tasting the air instead of smelling it, which is honestly worse. Sixth, there's the fear, the constant gnawing terror that at any moment a shell could land directly in your section of trench and you'd be vaporized or buried alive or blown apart. And this fear makes your heart race and your palms sweat despite the cold. And it ensures that even if you somehow manage to doze off for a few minutes, you'll jerk awake at the slightest sound, convinced that death is incoming. And seventh, there's the psychological weight of knowing that this is your life now. That tomorrow night will be exactly the same. And the night after that, and the night after that, stretching forward into an infinite future of cold and wet and fear and sleeplessness until either the war ends or you die, whichever comes first. Dawn breaks over the western front with all the beauty of a migraine. The gray light revealing a landscape so utterly devastated that your brain initially refuses to accept it as real. And this is when you get your first good look at no man's land. The strip of earth between your trench and the German lines that ranges from 50 yards to half a mile wide, depending on where you are. Stand to happens at dawn, a military tradition where every soldier in the trench mans the fire step with rifle ready because this is when attacks most often occur. And your sergeant is screaming at you to get up on that step and look alert, even though you haven't slept and your legs are shaking from exhaustion and cold. And when you finally climb up and peer over the parapet through the gap between sandbags, what you see erases any romantic notions you might have still harbored about warfare. No man's land is a moonscape, a wasteland, a vision of the apocalypse that some artillery officer has been perfecting for months. The ground is nothing but overlapping shell craters filled with brown water, the earth churned and rechurned by high explosives until there's no vegetation left. No grass, no trees except for occasional skeletal trunks that stand like accusatory fingers pointing at the sky. Barbed wire stretches in tangled belts that can be 50 feet deep in places. Rusted metal twisted into patterns that would be almost beautiful if they weren't designed to tear human flesh. And in this wire you can see things hanging. Objects that from this distance might be sandbags or equipment, but which you suspect are actually bodies that no one has been able to recover. The German trench line is visible as a dark scar in the earth. And occasionally you see movement, a helmet appearing for a moment before disappearing. And you realize with a sick jolt that they're watching you just like you're watching them. That somewhere in that opposite trench is a German soldier having exactly the same experience you're having, terrified and cold and wishing he was anywhere else. The mud in no man's land isn't the regular mud you'd find in a field back home. It's a special kind of mud created by mixing topsoil with high explosives and human remains and the chemical residue of gas attacks. And this mud has a consistency somewhere between wet concrete and quicksand. And men who fall into shell craters filled with this mud will drown in it if no one can pull them out in time. You can smell no man's land from the trench, a combination of rot and chemicals that makes the trench smell seem almost pleasant by comparison. And you understand now why the veterans don't go out into no man's land unless ordered to do so at gunpoint. After stand to, you're allowed to stand down, to step off the fire step and try to find something resembling breakfast. And this is when you discover that the food in the trenches makes the staging area meals seem like haute cuisine. Because what you're getting is hardtack. So hard it can break your teeth if you try to bite it without soaking it first. And tea that tastes like it was brewed in a rusty bucket, which it probably was. And if you're lucky, maybe some tinned meat that's of such dubious origin that the soldiers have nicknamed it bully beef. Though it's probably not from a bull and might not even be beef. The daily routine in the trenches is designed to keep you busy, because idle soldiers start thinking about their situation, and thinking leads to panic or despair or mutiny. So the Army has very helpfully filled every waking hour with tasks that range from pointless to actively dangerous. Your day begins with stand to at dawn. Then after the brief mockery of breakfast comes inspection, where an officer walks down the trench line, examining your rifle, your uniform, your general state of hygiene, and finding everything wanting because maintaining military standards in a muddy ditch is essentially impossible. But they're going to make you try anyway. Then comes trench maintenance. And this is where you discover that the trench is in a constant state of decay. The walls collapsing from the weight of wet earth, the sandbags rotting and splitting, the duckboards sinking into the mud. And your job is to fight this entropy with whatever materials you can scrounge, which usually means filling more sandbags with mud and stacking them on walls that are already failing, or replacing rotten duckboards with slightly less rotten duckboards salvaged from a quieter section of trench, or trying to dig drainage channels that will direct water away from your position even though the water table is so high that you're basically standing in an underground river. You're doing all this maintenance work while bent over in a space barely wide enough for your shoulders, while exhausted from lack of sleep, while being shot at by snipers who are watching for any head or hand that appears above the parapet, and occasionally while being shelled by artillery that doesn't need to see you to kill you. The work is backbreaking and endless. And just when you get one section of wall repaired, another section collapses. And you begin to understand that this is a war of attrition, not just against the enemy, but against the earth itself, against gravity and moisture, and the fundamental tendency of all things to fall apart. Between maintenance tasks, there's sentry duty, where you stand on the fire step with your rifle and watch no man's land for signs of enemy activity. And this sounds easy until you've been doing it for 2 hours in the rain, and your eyes are burning from the strain of staring at the same patch of devastated ground, looking for movement that might be an attack, or might be a rat, or might be nothing at all. There are also carrying parties, where you're assigned to haul supplies from the rear areas up to the front line. And this means trudging through communication trenches with heavy boxes of ammunition or sandbags, or rations or water. And the communication trenches are even narrower than the fire trenches, and they're full of other carrying parties going in the opposite direction. So you're constantly squeezing past each other while trying not to drop whatever you're carrying into the mud. And there's the perpetual task of dealing with the rats, which involves setting traps and laying poison and occasionally just beating them to death with your entrenching tool when they get bold enough to steal food right out of your hands. Though this never makes a dent in their population, because for every rat you kill, 10 more appear to take its place. By the time evening stand rolls around, you're so exhausted that you can barely climb onto the fire step, but climb you do. Because missing stand means punishment. And punishment in the trenches can range from extra duty to field punishment number 1, where they tie you to a wagon wheel in no man's land for 2 hours as an example to others, which is essentially a death sentence dressed up as discipline. Let's talk about what happens to your body in the trenches. Because the enemy soldiers are only one of many things trying to kill you. And in many ways, they're not even the most dangerous threat you face on a daily basis. Start with your feet. Those appendages you've always taken for granted, and prepare for them to betray you in ways you never imagined possible. Trench foot is going to become your constant companion, a condition that occurs when your feet are constantly wet and cold for extended periods. And in the trenches, your feet are always wet because you're standing in water that ranges from ankle deep to knee deep, depending on rainfall and drainage. And this water is mixed with urine and feces and decomposition, creating a bacterial soup that's actively hostile to human tissue. The first signs of trench foot are numbness and tingling, which actually seems like a blessing because at least you can't feel the cold anymore. But then comes the swelling, your feet expanding inside your boots until the leather cuts into your ankles. And then the skin starts to die, turning first red, then blue, then black. And if you're unlucky enough to let it progress this far, the flesh begins to rot while still attached to your body, and the only treatment is amputation. The army knows about trench foot, which is why you're supposed to change your socks regularly and rub whale oil on your feet and try to keep them dry. But changing socks in a waterlogged trench is like trying to stay dry while swimming. And whale oil is in short supply, and keeping your feet dry is literally impossible when you're standing in a flooded ditch for weeks at a time. Then there's the lice. And oh God, the lice. These tiny parasites that infest every soldier's uniform and live in the seams of your clothing where they lay eggs and breed in numbers that would be impressive if they weren't so absolutely revolting. You can feel them crawling on your skin, biting you, feeding on your blood. And the itching is so intense that men scratch themselves raw, opening wounds that then become infected with the bacteria that's everywhere in the trenches. The only way to deal with lice is to run a candle flame along the seams of your uniform to kill the eggs, a process called chatting. And you can spend an hour doing this and kill hundreds of lice. And the next day, there will be just as many, because they breed faster than you can kill them, and they spread from soldier to soldier through contact in the crowded trenches. Your teeth are going to start falling out because the diet in the trenches lacks vitamin C and scurvy is rampant. And your gums will bleed and swell, and your breath will smell like death. Though, honestly, in the trenches, everyone's breath smells like death, so at least you fit in. You're going to develop boils and sores that won't heal because your immune system is compromised by stress and lack of sleep and malnutrition. And these sores will get infected and ooze pus. And you'll keep fighting because there's no sick leave in the trenches unless you're literally dying. And even then, they might make you wait until after stand to. Your hands will crack and bleed from the cold and the constant dampness. The skin splitting open in painful fissures that make it agonizing to grip your rifle or hold anything. And you'll wrap them in whatever scraps of cloth you can find, but it won't help much because the wounds can't heal in these conditions. The latrines in the trenches deserve their own special circle of hell. And if Dante had experienced World War I, he would have added an entire canto just to describe the unique horror of trying to maintain basic bodily functions in conditions that seem specifically designed to make you long for death. The latrine is usually just a bucket or a pit dug at one end of the trench, covered with a wooden seat if you're lucky, completely exposed to the elements and to the view of your fellow soldiers because privacy is a luxury that doesn't exist in the trenches. Using this latrine requires you to strip off enough of your equipment to squat or sit, which means you're vulnerable. Your rifle is out of reach. And if a shell lands nearby or a gas attack begins while you're in this position, well, that's how you die pants down and dignity gone. The smell is indescribable, even by the low standards of the trenches, because this is where all the waste from dozens or hundreds of men accumulates, and the lime that's supposed to be sprinkled in to control odor and disease is always in short supply. So what you get is a concentrated essence of human effluent that makes your eyes water from 20 feet away. Dysentery is rampant in the trenches because the sanitation is non-existent, and the water is contaminated, and the food is questionable. And once you get dysentery, you're going to be visiting that latrine 10 or 15 times a day. And each visit is a humiliating, agonizing experience that leaves you weaker and more dehydrated. The Army's solution to dysentery is to keep you in the line anyway, because they can't afford to evacuate every soldier with digestive problems. So you're expected to fight while your body is literally evacuating itself from both ends. And this is another one of those details they never mention in the recruitment posters. And then there's the fact that the latrine is a prime target for enemy artillery because the Germans know where it is. They can smell it from their trenches. And apparently, some artillery officers find it amusing to shell the latrine area specifically, so you're risking death every time you need to defecate, which adds a whole new dimension of terror to a natural bodily function. The toilet paper, if you can call it that, is usually old newspapers or forms or whatever paper can be scrounged, and it's rough enough to cause bleeding, and you're using it with hands that are already cracked and infected. So now you're introducing more bacteria to areas that really don't need more bacteria, and the cycle of infection continues. Some men develop such severe constipation from dehydration and stress and the sheer psychological trauma of using the latrines that they don't defecate for days, which brings its own medical complications, while others develop the opposite problem and lose all control, soiling themselves in the trench because they can't make it to the latrine in time. And there's no shame anymore, because everyone understands that this is just what happens when you reduce human beings to this state. The worst part is that all of this, every disgusting detail, every humiliating moment, is considered normal, is accepted as just part of life in the trenches, and after a few days, you stop even thinking about it, because your standards of acceptable living conditions have dropped so low that having a designated place to shit is considered a luxury worth defending. Now let's discuss artillery, because this is what's really going to kill you, not heroic charges or hand-to-hand combat or sniper duels, but random high-explosive shells fired from guns you can't see by men who don't know your name and don't care whether you live or die because you're just a coordinate on a map. Artillery in World War I has evolved into a science of death, with guns ranging from small field pieces to massive railway-mounted monsters that can throw a shell weighing over a ton for miles. And these shells are going to fall on your position with a regularity that makes you question whether God exists, and if he does, whether he's actively malevolent. The sound of incoming artillery is something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Assuming you have a rest of your life, a screaming whistle that starts high and drops in pitch as the shell approaches. And in the seconds between hearing that whistle and the impact, you experience a kind of time dilation where your entire existence contracts to a single thought. Is this the one that kills me? The explosion, when it comes, is beyond anything your civilian brain can process. A physical assault on your senses that simultaneously sound and pressure wave and light and heat. And even if the shell doesn't land directly on you, the blast wave can rupture your internal organs, or the shrapnel can slice through your body, or the concussion can knock you unconscious, or the sheer terror can break your mind. Shrapnel is the real killer, because these shells are designed to fragment into hundreds of pieces of jagged metal that spread out in a sphere of death. And this metal doesn't care about cover. It ricochets off walls, it penetrates sandbags, it finds the gaps in your protection and enters your body at velocities that turn flesh into hamburger. The lucky ones die instantly, brains destroyed or hearts punctured or major arteries severed, bleeding out before they even understand what happened. The unlucky ones get gut wounds or limb wounds, and they lie in the bottom of the trench, screaming for medics while their friends can't help them because another barrage is incoming and everyone has to take cover. And sometimes these wounded men lie there for hours before help arrives, if help arrives at all. Then there are the men who get buried alive when a shell collapses the trench on top of them, trapped under tons of mud and sandbags, suffocating slowly in absolute darkness, while their comrades dig frantically to find them, though usually they're digging up a corpse. Artillery barrages can last for hours or days, a continuous pounding that prevents sleep or thought or anything resembling normal human function. And during these barrages, you crouch in whatever shelter you can find, and you pray, and you shake, and you lose control of your bladder. And you promise God, or yourself, or whoever's listening, that if you survive this, you'll be a better person. Though deep down, you know that's a lie because this experience is making you worse, is burning away everything soft and civilized, and leaving behind something hard and damaged and barely human. The randomness is what destroys you psychologically, because there's no skill involved in surviving an artillery barrage. No amount of training or courage or intelligence that makes a difference. It's pure chance. And knowing that your survival is completely out of your control is terrifying in a way that nothing else matches. Gas attacks represent a new kind of horror, because at least with bullets and shells you can see the threat coming. But poison gas is invisible, or nearly so. A creeping death that turns the very air into a weapon. And the first time you experience a gas attack, you understand that humanity has crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. The warning comes as a shout down the trench. Gas, gas, gas. And you have maybe 15 seconds to get your gas mask on before the chlorine or phosgene or mustard gas reaches your position. And these 15 seconds are the most terrifying of your life because you're fumbling with a mask that's stored in a bag at your hip. And your hands are shaking, and the mask has straps that need to be tightened just right, or it won't seal. And if it doesn't seal, you're going to die choking on your own melted lungs. The gas mask itself is a medieval-looking contraption with glass eyepieces and a filter canister. And once it's on, your breathing is restricted to slow, deliberate pulls through the filter. And the eyepieces fog up so you can barely see. And you sound like Darth Vader if Darth Vader was terrified and possibly dying. Chlorine gas smells like bleach and it burns, turning the moisture in your lungs into hydrochloric acid. And men who breathe it cough up pieces of their lung tissue while their eyes stream and their skin blisters. Phosgene is worse because it's nearly odorless and the effects are delayed, so you might think you're fine and take off your mask. And then 6 hours later, your lungs start filling with fluid and you drown on dry land. Mustard gas is the worst of all. An oily, yellow-brown cloud that doesn't just attack your lungs, but your skin as well, causing enormous blisters that weep fluid and become infected. And it lingers in the environment for days, contaminating everything it touches. So you can't touch anything without gloves, and you certainly can't take off your mask, even after the attack seems to be over. Men blinded by gas stumble through the trenches with hands on the shoulders of the man in front of them. A chain of the wounded leading the wounded. And some of them will recover their sight and some won't. And the ones who don't are sent home to live the rest of their lives in darkness, assuming they survive the journey back. The psychological impact of gas is enormous because it violates the basic assumption that air is safe, that breathing is a neutral act. And after you've experienced a gas attack, you're constantly paranoid, sniffing the air for the telltale smell of almonds or bleach or freshly cut hay. Any of the scents that might signal death is incoming. You sleep with your gas mask next to your head. You practice putting it on in the dark until you can do it in under 5 seconds. You become obsessive about checking the seal and replacing the filter, because this piece of equipment is literally the difference between life and an agonizing death. And the worst part is that gas doesn't discriminate. It flows into dugouts and shell holes. It settles in low areas. It can be blown back over your own lines by a change in wind. And there are documented cases of entire units being gassed by their own side's weapons, which adds a layer of bitter irony to an already horrific situation. Snipers are the bogeymen of the trenches. Invisible killers who can take your life from hundreds of yards away while you're doing something as mundane as lighting a cigarette or looking over the parapet for a second too long. And the psychological impact of knowing that at any moment a bullet might punch through your skull is corrosive in a way that's hard to articulate. The German snipers are particularly good at their job, trained marksmen with scoped rifles who've turned killing into an art form. And they have the advantage because for much of the war they hold the high ground, occupying ridges and elevated positions that give them excellent views of the British trenches. They work from concealed positions, loopholes in concrete bunkers, or carefully camouflaged hides in no man's land. And they have the patience to wait for hours or days for the perfect shot, for that one moment when you make a mistake and expose yourself. The rules for avoiding snipers are simple in theory, but nearly impossible to follow in practice. Never show your head above the parapet. Never create a silhouette against the sky. Never follow a routine that a sniper can predict. Never light 3 cigarettes from the same match, because by the 3rd light, the sniper has had time to aim and fire. Never use the same loophole twice. Never, ever think you're safe. But you're going to break these rules because you're human. And humans get careless when they're exhausted and bored and terrified. And that's when the sniper gets you. A sudden crack of a rifle, and the man next to you drops with a hole in his head, dead before he hits the duckboards. And you didn't see the muzzle flash, didn't hear anything except the impact. And now you're staring at his body, wondering which of the 1,000 spots out there in no man's land the shot came from. Some soldiers develop an almost supernatural sense for snipers, claiming they can feel when they're being watched, a prickling on the back of the neck that makes them duck or move. And maybe this 6th sense is real, or maybe it's just survivor bias. The men who didn't have it are already dead. The British eventually developed their own sniper corps. And these men are artists of death, using camouflage and fieldcraft and an intimate knowledge of ballistics to hunt their German counterparts. And there's a whole shadow war happening between snipers, a private duel that the regular infantry barely understands. Periscopes become essential equipment, allowing you to see over the parapet without exposing your head. But the Germans wise up to this and start targeting periscopes, so you rig dummy periscopes to draw fire and reveal sniper positions. And they counter by shooting the dummy periscopes anyway, just to keep you paranoid. The whole thing becomes a chess game played with human lives as the pieces. Men die from sniper fire while eating, while writing letters home, while talking to friends, while doing absolutely nothing wrong except existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there's something particularly cruel about this kind of death. So personal and targeted compared to the random impersonality of artillery. The dead are everywhere in the trenches and around them, because the Western Front is essentially a graveyard that people are still fighting in. And your relationship with corpses is going to become disturbingly casual, in ways that would have horrified your former civilian self. Bodies lie in no man's land, where they fell during the last attack, or the attack before that, or the attack 6 months ago. And nobody can recover them because going out there during daylight is suicide, and nighttime recovery missions are dangerous and often fail. So these bodies just stay there, decomposing slowly, becoming part of the landscape. You learn to identify how long a body has been there by its state of decay. The fresh ones still look human. The week-old ones are bloated and discolored. The month-old ones are mostly skeleton with some dried tissue. And the really old ones are just bones and scraps of uniform tangled in the wire. The smell of decomposition is your constant companion, so pervasive that you stop noticing it consciously, though it's always there in the background, a sweet, sick odor that clings to your uniform and hair and gets into your food. Sometimes a shell will land near an old grave and blow the body back into the trench. And you'll be doing maintenance work when you uncover a hand or a skull or an entire corpse that's been buried in the wall. And this is considered completely normal. You just shovel it back into the mud and continue with whatever you were doing. The trench walls themselves often contain bodies or parts of bodies from previous occupants. Because when a shell collapsed a section of trench and buried men alive, the survivors didn't dig them all out. They just rebuilt the wall with the bodies still in it. And now you're leaning against a wall that's part sandbag, part earth, and part human remains. You'll be eating your rations and notice that your elbow is resting on what appears to be a femur sticking out of the mud. And you'll just move your elbow and keep eating because what else are you going to do? The rats feed on the dead, which is why they're so large and so numerous. And watching rats swarm over a corpse in no man's land is a sight that never stops being disturbing, even though you've seen it 100 times. Sometimes you use the dead for practical purposes. A body in no man's land becomes a landmark for navigation, 50 yards past the dead German with a missing leg. Or bodies are used to reinforce parapet walls because they're more available than sandbags. You stop thinking of them as people who had names and families and dreams. They're just objects now, part of the environment. And this psychological shift is necessary for your sanity, but also deeply damaging in ways you won't understand until after the war. If you survive the war. The smell gets worse in summer when the heat accelerates decomposition. And there are stories of men going mad from the stench, refusing to eat, unable to sleep, and breaking down. Completely because their brains can't handle the constant assault of death smell. You'll write letters home and not mention the dead, because how do you explain to your mother that you're literally surrounded by corpses? That you sleep in a trench where the walls leak fluid from decomposing bodies? That you've become so accustomed to death that you step over corpses without a second thought? Nighttime in the trenches is when the real work happens. When the cover of darkness allows for activities that would be suicide during daylight. And this means that your already minimal sleep is about to be interrupted by a series of tasks that range from tedious to absolutely terrifying. Wiring parties go out into no man's land to repair and expand the barbed wire defenses. And this is one of the worst duties you can draw, because you're working in the dark in an area that's covered by enemy machine guns, carrying heavy coils of wire that catch on everything and cut through your gloves and into your hands, trying to be silent while hammering stakes into ground that's either rock hard or soup soft. And at any moment, a flare could go up and illuminate you like an actor on a stage, except the audience is armed with rifles. The wire itself is vicious stuff. Not the regular farm fencing you might be familiar with, but military-grade barbed wire with barbs every few inches. And these barbs are designed to catch and hold human flesh. So if you get tangled in it during your work, extricating yourself is a slow, painful process that involves removing chunks of your skin and uniform. Listening posts are established in shell craters in no man's land. Forward positions where a couple of soldiers lie in the mud all night, straining to hear sounds of German activity, trying to detect a raid before it hits the main trench. And this duty is terrifying because you're isolated. You can't see anything, and every sound might be the enemy crawling toward you through the darkness. Trench raids are the most dangerous nighttime activity. Small parties of soldiers who blacken their faces with mud or burnt cork, arm themselves with clubs and knives and grenades, and cross no man's land to attack a section of the German trench, with the goal of killing some Germans, capturing prisoners for intelligence, and getting back alive. These raids are vicious. Close quarters affairs where you're fighting in the dark with weapons that make no sound so you don't alert the entire German line. And the mortality rate for raiders is staggeringly high, because even when the raid succeeds, getting back across no man's land while the Germans are now fully alert and shooting at everything that moves is nearly impossible. You might be tasked with carrying supplies forward, which means navigating through communication trenches in pitch darkness while loaded down with boxes of ammunition or sandbags or rations, trying not to trip over bodies or debris or the men sleeping in the trench bottom. And all of this while artillery randomly shells the area because the Germans know that supply movement happens at night. Or you might be on patrol, crawling through no man's land on your belly trying to gather intelligence on German wire positions or trench layouts, moving a few feet at a time, freezing whenever a flare goes up, your heart pounding so loud you're convinced the Germans can hear it. The exhaustion from these nighttime activities is cumulative and crushing, because you're not sleeping during the day either. You're on sentry duty or doing maintenance, or trying to rest in a space where rest is impossible. And after a few days without real sleep, your judgment deteriorates. You start seeing things that aren't there. You fall asleep standing up. And this is when mistakes happen, when you walk into wire, when you fall into a shell crater, when you shoot at shadows that turn out to be your own men. The mental breakdown that happens in the trenches has been given a name: shell shock. But this term doesn't begin to capture the complete psychological destruction that occurs when you subject a human being to months of constant terror and sleep deprivation and sensory assault. And you're going to watch men disintegrate mentally right in front of you. And you're going to worry constantly about when it will be your turn. Shell shock manifests in different ways, depending on the person and what finally breaks them. Some men develop uncontrollable tremors, their hands shaking so badly they can't hold a rifle or a cup of tea, their whole body vibrating like they're being electrocuted. Some go mute, losing the ability to speak, and they communicate through gestures and written notes if they can still write. Though sometimes they can't because their hands won't stop shaking. Some develop facial tics or repetitive behaviors, blinking constantly or touching their face over and over. Small rituals that give them the illusion of control in a situation where they have none. Some become catatonic, staring at nothing, not responding to orders or stimuli, effectively absent even though their body is still present. Some snap violently, attacking their fellow soldiers or officers, or running toward the German lines in a kind of suicidal charge that's not bravery, but breakdown. The official military response to shell shock is somewhere between incompetent and cruel. Because the high command doesn't really believe in psychological casualties. They think these men are malingerers or cowards. And the treatment ranges from a few days' rest behind the lines to being sent back into combat immediately to court-martial and execution for cowardice. There's no understanding that the human mind has limits, that you can't subject someone to artillery barrages that last for days, to watching their friends die in horrible ways, to living in conditions that would break a medieval peasant, and expect them to remain psychologically intact. Some medical officers are more enlightened and recognize shell shock as a genuine injury, but they have limited tools to treat it. Maybe some time in a hospital away from the front, maybe some crude talk therapy. But ultimately, these men are needed back in the trenches, so the recovery period is kept short regardless of whether they're actually recovered. You're going to develop your own coping mechanisms to try to avoid shell shock. Superstitions about lucky charms or specific routines, gallows humor that would seem insane to civilians, emotional numbing where you just stop feeling anything about the death and suffering around you, dissociation where you mentally separate yourself from what's happening to your body. You'll notice yourself changing, becoming someone your family wouldn't recognize, someone harder and colder and quicker to violence. And you'll wonder if you'll ever be able to change back, if that soft civilian self is gone forever or just buried under layers of trauma. You'll have nightmares when you do manage to sleep, reliving the worst moments or creating new horrors that are somehow worse than reality. And you'll wake up screaming or crying or punching whoever's nearest, because in your dream, they were the enemy. You'll develop anxiety about specific things. The sound of a whistle, because that means going over the top. The smell of gas, because that means fumbling for your mask in panic. Quiet periods, because those usually mean an attack is being prepared. And through all of this, you're expected to function, to follow orders, to fight effectively, to maintain discipline and military bearing. Because acknowledging that you're psychologically broken means being labeled a coward, and cowardice in wartime means execution. Rain is your enemy in the trenches. And not just because it's uncomfortable, though it is spectacularly uncomfortable, but because rain transforms the trenches from merely terrible to absolutely uninhabitable. And the Western Front gets a lot of rain because this is northern France and Belgium, and the weather here is consistently miserable. When it rains, and it rains often, the water has nowhere to go because the trenches are essentially ditches dug into clay soil with poor drainage. So the water just accumulates, rising from ankle deep to knee deep to waist deep if the rain continues for days. And you're standing in this water because there's nowhere else to stand. And the water is cold and filthy and mixed with everything that exists in the trench, including human waste and decomposition runoff and the chemical residue from gas attacks. Your feet are going to be wet constantly, and we've already discussed trench foot. But the rain makes it worse, because now your entire lower body is submerged in contaminated water that's actively trying to rot your flesh. The duckboards that are supposed to keep you out of the mud float away or sink under the weight of water. So you're wading through thick mud that grabs at your boots with every step. And sometimes men lose their boots entirely, sucked off their feet by the mud. And they have to continue with just socks or bare feet, which means trench foot becomes gangrene, becomes amputation. The walls of the trench, already unstable, become actively dangerous when wet because the sandbags absorb water and become heavy, and the whole structure wants to collapse. And it does collapse regularly. burying men or blocking passages or destroying hours of maintenance work in seconds. Sleep becomes even more impossible because there's nowhere dry to sit or lie down. You're either standing in water or sitting on the fire step with water lapping at your boots. And the cold and wet penetrate your clothes and your bones, and you shiver so hard that your teeth chatter and you bite your tongue bloody. Hypothermia becomes a real threat. Men dying not from enemy action, but from exposure. Their core temperature dropping until their organs shut down. And they're found in the morning slumped in the water, technically drowned, but really killed by the cold. The rain also makes everything slippery, so moving through the trench becomes treacherous. Men falling and breaking bones or sliding into the water and having to be pulled out by their comrades. And in some sections, the mud is so deep that men have drowned in it, falling face first into knee-deep mud and unable to push themselves up, suffocating in earth and water while their friends watch helplessly. Supplies become harder to move through flooded trenches, ammunition gets wet and unreliable, food gets soaked and spoils even faster than usual, and everything you own is perpetually damp, which means it's heavier and it smells worse and it chafes your skin raw. The Germans are dealing with the same rain, obviously, but somehow they seem better prepared. Their trenches have better drainage. Their dugouts are deeper and more elaborate. They have the advantage of choosing their positions first and taking the high ground, so the water runs down toward the British lines, which is just another way this war is unfair. You'll pray for the rain to stop, but when it does stop and the sun comes out, the water doesn't drain. It just sits there creating a breeding ground for mosquitoes and other insects. And the smell gets worse as the water stagnates, and you realize that maybe the rain wasn't the worst thing after all. Machine guns are the reason this war has turned into a static nightmare of trenches instead of the mobile warfare that everyone expected. And when you finally experience a machine gun firing at you, you'll understand why cavalry charges and infantry assaults across open ground have become obsolete overnight, replaced by this grinding stalemate where territory is measured in yards and paid for in thousands of lives. The machine gun most likely to kill you is the German MG, a water-cooled beast that can fire 600 rounds per minute with terrifying accuracy. And when one of these guns opens up on your position, the sound is like nothing else. A rapid, stuttering roar that seems to fill the entire world. And the bullets come so fast, they're essentially a continuous stream of death cutting through everything in their path. The psychological impact of being under machine gun fire is profound and immediate. You hear that distinctive sound, and your body reacts before your brain catches up. You're diving for cover, or pressing yourself into the earth, or freezing in place depending on where you are. And your heart is hammering so hard you can feel it in your throat. And you know with absolute certainty that if you're caught in the open when that gun starts firing, you're dead. No skill or luck or prayer is going to save you. Machine guns are positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across no man's land, which means that no matter which direction you run, you're running into another machine gun's kill zone. And the Germans have had years to perfect these positions, to mark ranges and create fire lanes where nothing can survive. A single machine gun can hold an entire battalion at bay, can stop 1,000 men dead in their tracks, because charging a machine gun is suicide dressed up as bravery. And the generals keep ordering these charges anyway, because they haven't figured out a better solution. The tracers from machine guns create beautiful and terrifying patterns in the dark. streams of light that arc across no man's land, showing exactly where death is coming from. And for every tracer round, you can see there are 4 regular rounds you can't see. So if you're watching tracers pass near you, bullets are passing even nearer. The sound of machine gun bullets hitting things is varied, and all of it is terrible. They crack when they pass close to your head, creating a sonic boom that makes your ears ring. They thud when they hit sandbags or earth. They ping when they hit metal. They make a wet slapping sound when they hit human bodies. And all of these sounds become seared into your memory. Men who get hit by machine gun fire don't just fall down like in the movies. They're often torn apart. Because these bullets are traveling at high velocity and they tumble when they hit flesh, creating massive wound channels. And a burst of machine gun fire can turn a human torso into hamburger in less than a second. The survival strategy for machine gun fire is simple. Don't be where the gun is shooting. But this is harder than it sounds because machine guns traverse, sweeping back and forth across their field of fire. And even if you're in a shell hole or behind cover, the gunner is systematically searching for you, walking the fire closer, and eventually he'll find you unless the gun jams or runs out of ammunition or he gets killed by counter-fire. Your own side has machine guns too. But somehow they never seem as effective as the German guns. Maybe because the Germans have better positions or better training or just more guns. And you can hear your machine guns firing in support, but they don't seem to make the same impact. Don't create the same fear in the enemy that their guns create in you. Going over the top is the moment you've been dreading since you arrived at the front. The culmination of all your fears concentrated into a single act of walking toward machine guns across open ground. And when the order finally comes, you'll discover that your body doesn't want to obey, that every survival instinct you possess is screaming at you to stay in the trench where there's at least the illusion of safety. The attack is preceded by an artillery barrage that's supposed to destroy the German wire and kill their machine gunners and make the assault feasible. And this barrage lasts for hours or days, shelling the German lines until the ground is nothing but craters, and the noise is so constant, it stops registering as individual explosions and becomes just a continuous roar. You're told that after this barrage, nothing could possibly survive. That the German trenches will be obliterated and the wire will be cut, and all you have to do is walk across and occupy the position. But you're not stupid. You've heard these promises before. And you know that the Germans have deep dugouts that protect them from artillery. And that wire is harder to cut than the officers think. And that their machine guns have a nasty habit of surviving barrages. The night before the attack, you don't sleep. Nobody sleeps. You write letters home that might be your last letters. You check your equipment obsessively. You make dark jokes with your friends about who's going to die first. And underneath all of this is a terror so profound that you feel like you might vomit or faint or just refuse to go. Though refusing means execution, so that's not really an option. They issue you rum before the attack. Enough to take the edge off the fear, but not enough to make you drunk. Though some men save up their rum ration for weeks specifically for this moment and drink themselves into a state where they don't care if they live or die. You fix your bayonet. You adjust your kit one more time. You climb onto the fire step and wait for the whistle. And the seconds before that whistle blows are the longest of your life, stretching out into an eternity where you're trapped between the present, where you're still alive, and the future where you're probably dead. The whistle blows, sharp and piercing over the artillery. and you climb out of the trench into no man's land. And the first thing you notice is that it's harder to walk than you expected because the ground is torn up and you're carrying 70 pounds of equipment and your legs feel like they don't belong to you, like you're controlling them from a distance. The artillery barrage is supposed to lift and move forward as you advance, creating a rolling wall of explosions ahead of you. But the timing is imperfect, and sometimes shells fall short and kill your own men. And sometimes the Germans start shooting before you're even close to their lines because the barrage didn't kill them after all. Men start falling almost immediately, shot by machine guns or picked off by rifles or blown apart by artillery. And you keep walking because stopping means you're definitely dead, whereas walking forward means you're probably dead. And that slight difference is enough to keep your feet moving. The wire is where most men die during an attack, because the artillery that was supposed to cut it rarely does a thorough job. And what you encounter is not a clear path to the German trenches, but a nightmare maze of tangled metal 50 feet deep. And you have to get through it somehow while machine guns are firing at you, and you're a slow-moving target caught like a fly on flypaper. The wire cutters you've been issued are nearly useless against the thick strands of military barbed wire, and trying to cut wire while under fire is like trying to perform surgery while someone shoots at you. Your hands are shaking, the wire keeps slipping, the cutters aren't strong enough, and every second you spend struggling with the wire is another second the German machine gunners have to adjust their aim. Some sections of wire have been cut by the artillery, creating narrow gaps that everyone tries to funnel through. But the Germans know where these gaps are because they can see them too, and they've pre-sighted their machine guns on these exact spots. So the gaps become killing zones where bodies pile up as wave after wave of soldiers try to force their way through. Men throw themselves on the wire trying to create a bridge with their bodies so others can cross over them. And this sometimes works, but it means using your friends as ladder rungs, stepping on their backs and heads while they scream or bleed or die beneath you. And this is the kind of thing that will haunt you forever if you survive. The wire catches everything. Your uniform, your equipment, your flesh. And once you're tangled, you're stuck, and panic sets in as you struggle to free yourself while bullets snap past your head. And sometimes you can't free yourself. Sometimes the wire has you, and all you can do is hang there and wait to be shot, or for someone to cut you loose if they're brave enough to stop and help. Some men get tangled, and then a shell lands near them, and the blast doesn't kill them, but tosses them further into the wire, wrapping them in metal until they're cocooned and can't move at all. And these men die slowly from exposure or wounds or shock, suspended in the wire like grotesque ornaments. You'll see men from previous attacks still hanging in the wire, dead for days or weeks, decomposing in place because nobody can recover them. And you have to navigate past these bodies, use them as markers, go left at the corporal with no head, straight through where the private is still tangled. And this casual use of the dead as navigation aids is just another sign of how far you've fallen from normal human behavior. If you do make it through the wire, you're exhausted and bleeding from a dozen wire cuts. Your uniform is torn. You've lost track of your unit because everyone's scattered to find gaps. And now you're facing the German trench, and the Germans are very much alive and ready to kill you. Because contrary to what the artillery officers promised, they were in their deep dugouts during the barrage, and they emerged when it lifted, and they're manning their positions with fresh ammunition and clear fields of fire. The attack has already failed, but you don't know it yet. You're still moving forward because that's what you were ordered to do. And somewhere behind you, an officer is deciding whether to send in more waves to support you or to call off the attack and leave you stranded in no man's land with no way forward and no way back. If by some miracle you actually reach the German trench, you're about to experience close quarters combat that's more brutal and primitive than anything your training prepared you for. Because fighting in trenches is nothing like the bayonet drills you practiced on straw dummies back in England. This is desperate, chaotic, animalistic violence in confined spaces where civilized rules don't apply anymore. You jump down into the trench and immediately you're in a different world, a narrow corridor where you can't see more than a few yards in any direction because of the zigzag design. And around any corner could be a German soldier with a rifle or a grenade or a club. And your reaction time is measured in fractions of a second. The Germans are defending their home turf. They know every inch of these trenches. They know where the dugouts are and where the dead ends are and where the machine gun positions are. And you're a confused invader stumbling through their territory with your heart pounding and your hands shaking and your brain screaming that you need to kill or be killed. Rifles are too long and unwieldy for trench fighting. So the weapon of choice becomes whatever you can swing in a confined space. Entrenching tools used as axes, clubs made from wood with nails driven through them, knives, bayonets used as stabbing weapons rather than on the end of rifles, and grenades. Lots of grenades, thrown around corners to clear dugouts and kill anyone hiding in the next crevice. The fighting is face-to-face and personal, in a way that's psychologically devastating. You're looking into the eyes of the man you're trying to kill, close enough to smell his fear, close enough to hear him beg or curse or pray. And then you're driving your weapon into his body and feeling the resistance of flesh and bone and the hot spray of blood. And this is not like shooting someone from a distance. This is intimate murder that leaves blood on your hands, literally and figuratively. Germans emerge from dugouts you thought were empty, sometimes surrendering with hands up, and sometimes throwing grenades, and sometimes doing both in sequence. And you have to make instant decisions about who's a threat and who isn't. Except everyone's a threat in this situation, even the wounded, even the ones who look like they're surrendering, because desperation makes men treacherous. The sound of trench fighting is chaotic and terrifying. Explosions from grenades, screaming from the wounded and dying, the thud of clubs hitting skulls, the scrape of bayonets on bone, gunshots that echo off the trench walls and make your ears ring, and officers shouting contradictory orders that you can barely hear over the noise. You're supposed to clear the trench section by section, moving forward in an organized fashion. But organization breaks down almost immediately because men get separated, because some traverses are blocked by collapsed walls or piled bodies, because the Germans are fighting with everything they have. And what you get instead is a series of small, vicious fights happening simultaneously throughout the captured section. Prisoners are supposed to be sent to the rear. But in the heat of combat, this doesn't always happen. Men are killed after surrendering because their captors are too amped up on adrenaline and fear to process the fact that they've won this particular encounter, or because taking prisoners is dangerous when you're still in a combat zone, or just because the killing has taken on its own momentum and stopping feels impossible. You're going to do things in this trench that you'll never tell anyone about. Things that would be war crimes if anyone was keeping score. But everyone is doing these things. It's normalized by the extremity of the situation. and the line between soldier and murderer has become so blurred it might as well not exist. The German counterattack is inevitable because high command on both sides has decided that every yard of ground is worth infinite lives. So even if you manage to capture a section of trench, you're not keeping it without a fight. And within hours, or sometimes minutes, the Germans are going to try to take it back with the same desperate violence you used to capture it. You're now defending a position you barely understand, in trenches that face the wrong direction because they were built to defend against attacks from your side. Which means the parapet you need is actually the parados, and the fire step is on the wrong wall, and everything is backwards and confusing. You're also exhausted from the attack. You've been awake for something like 40 hours. You're running on adrenaline that's starting to crash. You're low on ammunition because you used most of it getting here. And the promised reinforcements and supplies haven't arrived yet because the communication trenches are clogged with wounded going back and reserves trying to come forward. The Germans know you're weak. They know this is the best time to hit you before you can consolidate. So they launch their counterattack while you're still trying to reorganize. And suddenly you're the ones being attacked. You're the ones watching waves of field gray uniforms coming across no man's land. And you realize with a sick feeling that you're about to experience what the Germans experienced when you attacked them. Your machine guns, if you have any, are still being set up or are jammed or were destroyed in the fighting. So you're defending with rifles and whatever ammunition you have left. And you're shooting at Germans who are doing exactly what you did a few hours ago, walking toward death with grim determination. Some of them make it through the wire. Some of them reach the trench. And now you're fighting the same kind of close-quarters battle you just survived, except this time you're defending instead of attacking. And the roles have reversed, but the violence is identical. Men you fought beside during the attack die during the defense, shot or grenaded or clubbed to death by Germans who want their trench back. And the position changes hands again. And maybe it will change hands a third time before the day is over. This tiny section of muddy ditch that both sides have decided is strategically vital even though it's tactically worthless. The casualty count for capturing and then losing and then recapturing 100 yards of trench can run into the thousands. And at the end of it all, the front line is in roughly the same place it was before the attack. Except now there are more bodies in no man's land, and more names on the casualty lists, and more grieving families back home, wondering if their son's death achieved anything. You might hold the position, you might lose it, or you might be ordered to withdraw because high command has decided this particular piece of ground isn't worth any more lives, which makes you wonder why it was worth all the lives already spent on it. But questioning orders is not your job. Your job is to follow them and survive if you can. If you do withdraw, you're going to leave wounded behind because there's no time or manpower to evacuate everyone. And these men are going to be captured or killed by the Germans, and you're going to hear their screams as you retreat. And this is another thing that will haunt you forever. The wounded are everywhere after an attack, lying in no man's land where they fell, crying out for help that might not come. And the stretcher bearers are heroes beyond measure because they're going out into that killing ground to try to retrieve casualties, while German snipers and machine gunners are still active. These stretcher bearers wear Red Cross armbands that are supposed to protect them under the Geneva Convention. But the Germans either don't care or can't see the armbands, or have decided that anyone in no man's land is a legitimate target. So the stretcher bearers die at alarming rates, shot while trying to load wounded men onto stretchers, killed while carrying casualties back to the trenches. You might be one of the wounded, lying in a shell crater with a bullet in your leg or shrapnel in your guts, bleeding into the mud, and you can see the British trenches 100 yards away. But you can't reach them because you can't walk, and anyone who tries to help you gets shot. You lie there for hours, maybe a full day, watching the sun move across the sky, getting thirsty, and then desperately thirsty, and then so thirsty you drink the contaminated water in the crater if you could reach it. And the pain from your wound is constant and awful. But eventually, it fades to a dull throb as shock sets in. Some wounded men die from their injuries, bleeding out slowly or succumbing to shock or infection. And some die from exposure, freezing to death during the night or dying of thirst during the day. Some are killed by subsequent artillery barrages, shells landing among the wounded and finishing what the initial attack started. And there's something particularly cruel about surviving the battle only to be killed by random artillery while you're lying helpless. The ones who do get retrieved are taken to a regimental aid post, a dugout in the support trenches where a medical officer does triage with limited supplies and no proper equipment. And this is where you learn that military medicine in World War I is primitive at best and lethal at worst. The medical officer looks at your wound and makes a decision. Can you be saved with the resources available? And if so, are you worth saving given the number of other casualties waiting for treatment? If you have a minor wound, you get bandaged and sent back to the line. If you have a serious but potentially survivable wound, you get minimal treatment and are sent further back to a casualty clearing station where there are actual surgeons. If your wound is hopeless, you get morphine and are moved to a corner to die quietly so you don't take up space or resources. There's no anesthetic except morphine, no antibiotics, no understanding of sterile technique beyond the most basic level. And surgery is performed with instruments that would horrify modern doctors, often in dugouts or tents with minimal lighting and flies everywhere. Amputations are common because that's the solution to shattered limbs or severe infections. And these amputations are performed quickly and brutally because there are dozens more wounded waiting and the surgeon doesn't have time for finesse. If you survive the initial treatment and get evacuated further back, you might end up in a proper hospital where you can actually recover. Or you might die of infection or shock or complications during the journey back, transported in ambulances that are little more than trucks with no suspension driving over roads full of potholes. Letters from home arrive irregularly, and they're both a blessing and a curse. Because reading about normal life back in England reminds you of everything you've lost and might never regain. And the gulf between what your family thinks you're experiencing and the actual reality is so vast that you can't bridge it with words. Your mother writes about the garden and the neighbors and how proud she is of you. And you're reading this while sitting in a trench that smells like death and human waste, covered in lice, trying not to think about the corpse that's partially buried in the wall next to you. Your sweetheart writes about how she misses you and hopes you're staying safe and warm. And you want to laugh, except laughing would turn into crying, because you can't remember the last time you were truly warm and safe is a concept that doesn't exist anymore. Your father writes about duty and honor and serving your country, and you realize that he has no concept of what service actually means in this war. That honor died in the mud somewhere between your trench and the German wire. You can't tell them the truth because your letters are censored by officers who read everything you write and cross out anything that might damage morale or reveal military information. And anyway, even if you could write freely, what would you say? How do you explain that you've become someone they wouldn't recognize? That you've killed men with your hands? That you've seen things that have fundamentally broken something inside you? You can't write about the constant fear or the friends who died or the way you've started to think about death as a welcome release, because these things aren't allowed, and also because putting them into words would make them too real, would force you to confront what this war has done to you. So instead, you write cheerful lies. You tell them you're fine, the food is adequate, the weather is tolerable, your spirits are high, and you hope the war will be over soon. You write these lies, and they write back believing them. And the disconnect grows wider with every exchange, until you feel like you're corresponding with people from another planet, people who exist in a reality so different from yours that meaningful communication has become impossible. Some men stop writing altogether, can't maintain the fiction anymore, and their families back home panic thinking they're dead when actually they're just too broken to pretend. Other men become obsessive letter writers, composing long, detailed letters about nothing, filling pages with observations about weather and routine, because if they stop writing, they'll have to think about where they are and what they're doing. You save letters from home in your pack, read them multiple times, and occasionally letters get destroyed by mud or blood or shell blasts. And losing a letter feels like losing a piece of your former self. Reading letters from men who died is part of the grim routine. An officer goes through a dead soldier's effects, finds letters from his mother or wife or girlfriend, and these letters have to be sent back with the personal effects. But first, someone has to write to the family, explaining that their son or husband or brother is dead. And these death letters follow a template because individuality would make the task impossible when you're writing dozens of them after every attack. Food in the trenches ranges from barely edible to actively dangerous. And the chronic malnutrition you're experiencing is slowly destroying your body in ways that won't become apparent until months or years after the war, assuming you survive that long. The official ration is supposed to provide adequate calories and nutrition, and on paper, it looks reasonable. Bread or hardtack, tinned meat, tea, sugar, jam, and occasionally fresh vegetables or meat when supplies permit. In practice, what actually reaches you in the frontline trenches is a degraded version of these rations, because the food has to travel from supply depots through miles of communication trenches, often under artillery fire, carried by exhausted men who sometimes eat portions of what they're supposed to be delivering because they're hungry too. The bread arrives stale and moldy, having sat in dampness for days, and you eat it anyway because it's calories, and calories are survival. The hardtack is so hard it can break teeth, and the standard method is to soak it in tea or water until it becomes soft enough to chew. Except this also makes it slimy and unpleasant, and occasionally you discover weevils or other insects in the softened mass. Protein you didn't ask for, but which you'll probably eat anyway. The tinned meat, universally known as bully beef, regardless of what animal it supposedly came from, has a texture and flavor that suggests it might not be meat at all, but rather some kind of industrial byproduct that's been pressed into meat shape. And it's so salty that eating it makes you desperately thirsty, which is a problem because water is rationed, and what water you have is questionable quality. The tea is brewed in containers that are also used for other purposes, and never properly cleaned. So it tastes like metal and old water and whatever residue was in the container before. But it's hot and contains caffeine and sugar, so you drink it gratefully. Jam is a luxury that appears irregularly. And when it does appear, it's usually plum and apple, the same flavor day after day until you're sick of it. But it's sweet and provides quick energy, so you spread it on hardtack and pretend it's a decent meal. The hot meals that are supposed to come up from field kitchens in the rear often arrive cold because the journey takes hours and there's no way to keep food warm. And sometimes they don't arrive at all because the carrying party got shelled or lost in the maze of trenches or just gave up. Fresh meat, when it appears, is often spoiled by the time it reaches you because there's no refrigeration, and the meat has been sitting in warmth long enough for bacteria to multiply to dangerous levels. And men who eat this meat develop food poisoning and dysentery, adding to the already overwhelming sanitation problems. Vegetables are even rarer than meat and usually arrive as limp, rotting specimens that look like they died weeks ago. Though you'll still eat them because your body is desperately craving vitamins that the processed rations don't provide. You're constantly hungry even after eating because the rations don't provide enough calories for the physical demands of trench life. And this hunger is a grinding, persistent companion that makes everything harder, makes the cold feel colder, makes exhaustion more profound, makes your temper shorter and your judgment worse. Water is more precious than ammunition in the trenches. And the struggle to get enough clean water to drink is a daily battle that you're slowly losing. Because the water supply system is inadequate. And what water does reach you is often contaminated with everything from bacteria to chemical residue from gas attacks. The official water ration is supposed to be 1 gallon per man per day, which sounds adequate until you realize this has to cover drinking, cooking, washing, and any other water needs. And in practice, you're lucky to get half that amount. Water is transported to the front lines in petrol cans that have been repurposed. And no matter how thoroughly these cans are cleaned, they always retain a faint taste of petroleum. So everything you drink has this underlying chemical flavor that makes you slightly nauseous. The water itself comes from wells or rivers behind the lines. And by the time it reaches you, it's been sitting in those cans for hours or days, exposed to whatever contamination exists in the trenches. And drinking it is a gamble between hydration and illness. Some units have water purification tablets, small chlorine tablets that make the water taste even worse, but theoretically kill bacteria. Though they don't do anything about chemical contamination or the petroleum taste. So you're drinking water that tastes like a combination of bleach and gasoline. And this is considered an improvement over untreated water. The alternative is to drink from shell holes, which contain stagnant rainwater mixed with mud and probably decomposition runoff. And men who are desperate enough to drink this water often develop cholera or typhoid or dysentery, diseases that can kill you just as effectively as German bullets. Dehydration is a constant problem because you're losing fluids through sweat from physical labor, through the digestive issues that come from contaminated water and bad food, and through the simple fact that your body needs water to function and isn't getting enough. The symptoms of chronic dehydration become normalized. Headaches, dizziness, dark urine, cracked lips, decreased mental function, and eventually more serious problems like kidney damage that won't become apparent until after the war. Washing is a luxury that happens rarely, if at all, because using your limited water supply to wash your body or clothes means having less to drink. And drinking always takes priority over hygiene. Some men go weeks without properly washing, their skin caked with layers of dirt and sweat and blood. And the resulting skin infections and rashes add to the general misery. Shaving is required by military regulations because gas masks don't seal properly over beards. But shaving with cold water and a dull razor and no proper soap is an exercise in controlled violence against your own face, leaving you with cuts and razor burn that get infected because everything in the trenches gets infected. The Germans seem to have better water supplies, or at least that's the rumor. They have deeper wells and better purification systems, and their trenches aren't as waterlogged, which is just another way this war feels rigged against you. Another small advantage that compounds with all the other small advantages until the cumulative effect is crushing. The officers who command you exist in a completely different reality than the one you inhabit. And this gap between the brass and the enlisted men is so wide that it might as well be a chasm. And this chasm is filled with resentment and incomprehension, and occasionally outright hatred. Your platoon commander is probably a young lieutenant, possibly fresh from officer training school, who knows the theory of warfare from books and lectures, but has never experienced the reality of it. And he's terrified, but trying to hide it behind a facade of confidence that fools no one. He has to give orders that he knows might kill his men, has to maintain discipline even when the orders from higher up are obviously suicidal. And he's caught between his duty to the army and his duty to the soldiers under his command. And this tension eventually breaks most of them. The good lieutenants lead from the front, go over the top first, share the dangers and privations of their men. And these officers earn genuine respect and loyalty. And when they die, and they die at alarming rates because German snipers specifically target officers, their men genuinely mourn them. The bad lieutenants stay in the rear, issue orders from safety, blame their men for failures. And these officers are despised, and occasionally they die from bullets that came from behind them, if you know what I mean. Though this is never investigated too closely because proving that enlisted men murdered their officer is difficult when everyone in the unit claims they didn't see anything. Above the lieutenants are captains and majors and colonels, men who spend less and less time in the actual trenches as their rank increases. And by the time you get to the generals, you're talking about men who haven't seen the front lines in months or years, who plan attacks from chateaux 20 miles behind the lines, who study maps and move little flags around representing battalions as if those flags are chess pieces instead of thousands of living men. These generals still believe in the power of morale and elan. They think that courage and determination can overcome machine guns and barbed wire. And they keep ordering frontal assaults because they literally can't imagine an alternative. Because their entire military education was based on wars that were fought differently. And they're too old and too rigid to adapt. The casualty reports that reach the generals are just numbers on paper, sanitized and abstract. 2,000 casualties becomes moderate losses. A failed attack that gained nothing becomes local operations. Complete tactical disasters become battles of attrition, as if attrition is a strategy rather than an admission that you have no strategy. There's a rumor, probably apocryphal, but everyone believes it anyway, that a general once visited the front lines after months of ordering attacks. And when he saw the actual conditions, the mud and the wire and the devastation, he broke down crying and said, "My God, did we really send men to fight in this?" And his aide replied, "Yes, sir, and they're still there." Whether this story is true or not doesn't matter. It captures the essential truth that the men making decisions about your life have no idea what they're asking you to do. And this knowledge creates a bitterness that never fully goes away. The concept of going on leave, of actually leaving the trenches and going back to civilization for a week or two, seems impossible until it actually happens to you. And when your turn finally comes, the transition from hell to normalcy is so abrupt and jarring that your brain can't process it. And you spend your entire leave feeling like you're in a dream that you'll wake up from to find yourself back in the mud. The journey back from the front begins with being relieved by another unit, handing over your section of trench to fresh soldiers who look at you with a mixture of pity and fear, because you're what they'll become in a few weeks. And you look at them and can't remember ever being that clean or that naive. You march back through the communication trenches and then further back through supply depots and staging areas. And with each mile, the sound of artillery gets fainter. And this absence of sound is disorienting, because you've become so accustomed to the constant noise that silence feels unnatural. You get deloused at a facility behind the lines, stripping naked and standing in line with hundreds of other naked soldiers, while your uniform is taken away to be steamed and you're given a lukewarm shower that's the first real washing you've had in weeks. And even though the water is cold and the soap is harsh, it feels miraculous. You're issued a clean uniform, or at least a cleaner uniform than the one you were wearing, and you board a train that takes you further from the front, and through the windows you watch the devastated landscape gradually give way to farmland that's still being cultivated, villages that aren't ruins, people living normal lives. The train eventually reaches a port and you board a ship for England. And the crossing is calmer this time because you're not terrified of what's waiting on the other side. Though you are terrified of what's waiting when leave ends. England is shocking in its normality. People going about their business, shops open and selling things, streets that aren't cratered by shells, buildings that have roofs, women and children, and old people who aren't emaciated or shell-shocked. Your family greets you like a hero, and you try to smile and accept their congratulations. But you feel like an imposter because you don't feel heroic. You feel damaged and changed and fundamentally different from the person who left. They want to hear about your experiences, and you can't tell them. Not because of censorship, but because there are no words that would make them understand. And anyway, you don't want them to understand, because that would contaminate them with knowledge they shouldn't have. So you tell sanitized stories, you talk about the camaraderie and the bravery and leave out everything about the death and the fear and the degradation. And they're satisfied with these lies because the truth would be unbearable. You sleep in a real bed for the first time in months, and it's too soft and too quiet, and you can't relax. You keep jerking awake thinking you're hearing artillery or gas warnings, and eventually you give up and sleep on the floor because it feels more familiar. Returning to the front after leave is worse than going the first time, because now you know exactly what you're returning to. There's no illusion or uncertainty, just the cold knowledge that you're voluntarily walking back into hell. The last night at home is torturous. Your family trying to make it special, cooking your favorite meal, gathering for what might be the last time you're all together. And you're sitting there trying to memorize their faces because there's a very real possibility you won't see them again. The journey back reverses the journey out. Train to the port, ship to France, train toward the sound of guns that gets louder with every mile. And each stage of the journey, your anxiety increases until by the time you're approaching the front, your hands are shaking and you're having trouble breathing and you're seriously considering desertion, even though you know that means execution. You rejoin your unit, if your unit still exists, because sometimes you come back from leave to discover that your battalion got decimated in an attack while you were gone, and your friends are dead or missing. And you feel guilty for having been safe while they were dying, even though rationally you know that being on leave wasn't your choice. The other soldiers who didn't get leave yet look at you with envy and resentment. And the ones who already went on leave look at you with understanding because they know what you're feeling. That sense of having been given a glimpse of normal life only to have it snatched away again. You slip back into the routine of the trenches. And it's shocking how quickly the habits return, how fast you readjust to the cold and the wet and the fear. And within a few days, it's like you never left. Except now you have fresh memories of home to torture yourself with during the long nights. Some men break after returning from leave, their minds unable to reconcile the two worlds, and they refuse to fight, or they shoot themselves, or they do something that gets them court-martialed. Anything to avoid going back into combat now that they've remembered what peace feels like. Others become harder and more reckless, diving into combat with abandon, either trying to hasten their own deaths or trying to prove something to themselves about their courage. You're somewhere in the middle, trying to survive, trying not to think about home too much, because those thoughts make you weak, make you want things you can't have, make you long for a future that might not exist. The letters from home continue to arrive, and now they're worse because you know what your family looks like when they write these letters. You can picture them sitting at the kitchen table with pen and paper. And this makes the disconnect between their reality and yours even more painful. You write back less frequently because what is there to say? I returned to the trenches, and nothing has changed. Except I now remember what a clean bed feels like. And it makes sleeping in the mud even harder? You can't write that, so you write nothing. Or you write generic reassurances that you're fine and the war will be over soon. Lies that you don't believe, but that they need to hear. Winter in the trenches is when you discover new depths of misery that you didn't think were possible. Because if you thought the trenches were cold and wet during autumn, winter takes everything bad about the trenches and multiplies it by 10. The temperature drops below freezing and stays there for weeks. And you don't have adequate winter clothing because the Army supply system is overwhelmed, and anyway, they didn't plan for a war that would last through multiple winters. Your uniform is designed for autumn campaigning, not Arctic conditions. So you're wearing the same thin wool that was barely adequate in October and is laughably inadequate in January. And you layer on everything you have. Extra socks if you can get them, scarves, gloves that have holes in them, anything to add insulation. But it's never enough. The trenches fill with snow that melts during the day and refreezes at night, creating ice that makes the duckboards treacherous and the fire step nearly impossible to climb. And men slip and fall and break bones, and broken bones in the trenches mean evacuation if you're lucky, or slow death from complications if you're not. Your hands and feet are constantly on the edge of frostbite. The tissue dying from cold, turning white, then blue, then black. And frostbite is insidious because it doesn't hurt at first. The cold numbs everything. So you don't realize you're losing fingers or toes until it's too late. Trench foot combines with frostbite to create injuries that require amputation. And the medical facilities are overwhelmed with cold-related casualties. Men who didn't get shot or gassed, but who are losing limbs anyway, because the environment is killing them just as effectively as enemy action. The metal of your rifle is so cold it burns your skin when you touch it. And the oil in the rifle's mechanism freezes, making it unreliable. So you have to keep your rifle close to your body to keep it warm enough to function. Which means carrying even more weight even closer. The rations freeze solid. The bread turns into rocks. The water in your canteen becomes ice. And you have to thaw everything before you can consume it. Except there's rarely fire or heat available to do the thawing. So you eat frozen food that doesn't provide the calories your body needs to generate warmth. Sleep becomes even more impossible, because if you fall asleep in these temperatures without adequate shelter, you might not wake up. Men freeze to death while sleeping, their bodies shutting down from hypothermia. So you have to keep moving, keep your blood circulating, which means you're exhausted from lack of rest and from the constant shivering that's your body's attempt to generate heat. The Germans are dealing with the same winter, obviously. But the killing doesn't stop just because it's cold. Attacks still happen, patrols still go out, and fighting in winter conditions adds new levels of difficulty because frozen hands can't pull triggers reliably, frozen feet can't run, and the wounded freeze to death before stretcher bearers can reach them. The Christmas truce of 1914 has become a legend. But what nobody tells you about it is that it was unofficial, temporary, and never repeated. And if you're in the trenches in 1915 or later, Christmas is just another day of killing, with maybe slightly less enthusiasm than usual. The first Christmas of the war, when British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged gifts, played football, and sang carols together, was a spontaneous outbreak of humanity that high command on both sides viewed with horror, because fraternization with the enemy makes it harder to kill them the next day. By 1915, the generals have made it clear that any repetition of the Christmas truce will be considered mutiny, and officers are ordered to maintain hostilities regardless of the date. So Christmas in the later years of the war is marked by increased artillery fire, deliberate attacks timed for Christmas Day, anything to prevent soldiers from remembering that the men in the opposite trenches are human beings just like them. You still observe Christmas in small ways. Someone produces a bottle of something alcoholic that's been saved for the occasion. There might be special rations if supply lines are functioning. Letters from home arrive with Christmas wishes and small gifts that your family sent weeks ago, hoping they'd arrive in time. And these letters make you simultaneously grateful and heartbroken because they remind you of Christmases past when the biggest problem was what to get your sister as a gift. Religious services happen in the trenches. Chaplains conducting Christmas Mass in dugouts or open sections of trench. And you attend even if you're not particularly religious, because it's a reminder that civilization still exists somewhere. That there are still rules and rituals that aren't about killing. The chaplains do their best to provide spiritual comfort, talking about hope and redemption and the birth of Christ. And you listen and want to believe that there's meaning in all this suffering. But it's hard to reconcile the message of peace on earth with the reality that tomorrow you'll be shooting at other Christians who are also celebrating the same holiday. Some men break down during Christmas services. The contrast between the holy day and their unholy situation finally overwhelming their defenses. And they weep openly while the chaplain pretends not to notice and continues the service. The Germans celebrate Christmas too. You can hear them singing in their trenches, and the songs are different, but the sentiment is the same. And for a moment, you feel a connection to these enemy soldiers who are also far from home, also cold and miserable, also hoping to survive long enough to see another Christmas. But this feeling passes quickly because connection leads to sympathy, and sympathy makes it harder to kill. And killing is your job. So you push the feeling away and go back to thinking of the Germans as the enemy rather than as fellow sufferers. The day after Christmas, normalcy returns. The artillery resumes its regular schedule, patrols go out, the snipers return to work. And if anyone was thinking about peace or goodwill toward men, those thoughts are buried under the necessity of survival. And Christmas becomes just another memory of something that could have been, but wasn't. The concept of time becomes distorted in the trenches. Days blending into each other until you lose track of whether it's Tuesday or Saturday, what month it is, how long you've been at the front. And this temporal confusion is partly from exhaustion and partly from the fact that every day is essentially identical in its misery. You measure time not in hours or days, but in more immediate units. Time between artillery barrages, time until the next meal, time until you can be relieved, time until leave if you survive that long. The sun rises and sets, marking days you no longer count, and the seasons change, bringing different varieties of suffering, but not relief. And you realize you've been in the trenches for weeks or months, and it feels simultaneously like forever and like you just arrived yesterday. Some men keep meticulous records, writing in diaries every day, recording the weather and the casualties and the mundane details of trench life. And these diaries are either therapeutic acts of maintaining sanity or symptoms of obsessive behavior, depending on who you ask. Other men deliberately avoid knowing the date because knowing means counting. And counting means thinking about how many more days or weeks or months of this you might have to endure. And that kind of thinking leads to despair. The arrival of mail provides temporal markers. Letters postmarked 2 weeks ago telling you that someone got married or someone died. Or the weather back home is unusually warm for November. And these letters place you in time relative to the outside world, though that connection feels increasingly tenuous. You remember your former life in fragments, isolated memories that seem to belong to someone else. Walking to work on a sunny morning, eating dinner with your family, attending church on Sunday, sleeping until you naturally woke up, rather than being jolted awake by shelling. These memories become less vivid over time, replaced by an endless present tense of mud and fear. And you wonder if you'll ever be able to access those memories again, or if they're being permanently overwritten by trauma. The concept of the future becomes almost impossible to imagine, because imagining the future requires believing you have one. And in the trenches, the future extends about as far as tomorrow, maybe next week if you're optimistic. But anything beyond that is speculation so wild, it's not worth considering. Men talk about what they'll do after the war. Plans and dreams that become more elaborate the longer the war continues. But these conversations have an increasingly hollow quality because nobody really believes anymore that there will be an after, that this war will end, that they'll survive to see it. The past recedes, the future refuses to materialize, and you're trapped in an eternal present of suffering that feels like it will never end because time itself has become meaningless. Execution by firing squad is the Army's solution to desertion, cowardice, and mutiny. And the fact that soldiers are being killed by their own side for the crime of wanting to live is one of the great moral obscenities of this war, though it's justified with language about discipline and military necessity. You've seen men shot at dawn, led out blindfolded to a post in a courtyard or field behind the lines, 12 soldiers with loaded rifles forming the firing squad. Most of those rifles loaded with blanks so that no individual soldier knows for certain if they fired the killing shot. And this psychological trick is supposed to make the execution easier on the executioners, but it doesn't. It just spreads the guilt around. The condemned man is usually someone you know, someone who cracked under the pressure or who tried to run or who refused an order. And watching him die is watching yourself die in an alternate timeline where you made a slightly different choice. The crimes that merit execution are sometimes legitimate. Actual desertion with intent to aid the enemy, killing of fellow soldiers, refusing to fight in ways that endanger the unit. But more often, they're the result of shell shock or fear or exhaustion being misinterpreted as cowardice. And the army would rather kill a scared soldier than admit that their demands exceed human capacity. The trial, if you can call it that, is a formality. The accused usually has no real defense. The witnesses are officers with incentives to maintain discipline. And the verdict is predetermined because the army needs to make examples to keep everyone else in line. Some men go to their execution with dignity, refusing the blindfold, standing straight, facing the rifles without flinching, and these men earn a kind of respect even in death. Others break down completely, begging for mercy, crying, having to be held upright by guards. And these deaths are harder to watch because they confirm your worst fears about how you might behave in the same situation. The chaplain attends these executions, offering last rites or prayers, trying to provide spiritual comfort to a man about to be murdered by his own army. And you wonder how the chaplain reconciles this with his faith. How anyone reconciles this. After the execution, the body is buried quietly, usually without the honors given to men killed by the enemy, because dying at the hands of your own side is shameful somehow. As if being shot by Germans is noble, but being shot by British soldiers is disgraceful. The executions are supposed to be kept quiet, but word spreads through the ranks anyway. And rather than inspiring discipline, they inspire resentment and fear. Not fear of the enemy, but fear of your own command structure. Fear that if you break under pressure, you won't get help. You'll get a bullet. The Spanish flu arrives in 1918 and proceeds to kill soldiers more efficiently than the Germans ever did. And the bitter irony is that you survived years of artillery and gas and machine guns, only to be killed by a virus that doesn't care about your courage or training or experience. The flu spreads through the trenches like wildfire through a drought forest, soldiers living in close quarters with compromised immune systems, creating perfect conditions for transmission. And within days of the first cases appearing, whole units are incapacitated. The symptoms start innocuously enough. Fever, headache, body aches that you initially attribute to the normal misery of trench life. But then the fever spikes dangerously high. Your lungs fill with fluid, your skin turns blue from lack of oxygen, and you're drowning on dry land just like the men who breathed phosgene gas. The medical facilities are overwhelmed because this isn't a few casualties from an attack. This is hundreds of men falling sick simultaneously, and there's no treatment, no cure, just supportive care that usually isn't enough. Men die in dugouts and aid stations and hospitals behind the lines, their bodies disposed of in mass graves because there's no time or resources for individual burials when people are dying by the dozens every day. The flu doesn't discriminate. Young, healthy soldiers who survived the worst the war could throw at them die gasping for breath, while weaker men somehow survive. And this randomness is almost worse than combat, because at least in combat you can pretend that skill or caution might save you. But against the flu, there's nothing you can do. The war continues even as the flu rages, because High Command has decided that the flu is not sufficient reason to postpone operations. So you're expected to attack or defend or patrol while running a fever and coughing up blood. And men die from the flu while under fire, killed by disease before the Germans get a chance. Some units lose more men to the flu than they lost in major battles. Entire companies reduced to a fraction of their strength, not from enemy action, but from a microscopic organism that cares nothing for rank or medals or bravery. The flu spreads to civilians too, killing them in even greater numbers because they lack even the minimal medical care available to soldiers. And when you finally get letters from home, they're filled with news of deaths, your neighbors and relatives and friends succumbing to the same disease that's killing your comrades. The combination of war casualties and flu deaths creates a sense that the world is ending, that humanity is being systematically exterminated by the twin evils of violence and disease. And the fact that the war eventually ends in November 1918 doesn't feel like victory when half the people you knew are dead from bullets or flu or both. The rumor of armistice starts circulating in early November 1918, whispers that Germany is collapsing, that negotiations are happening, that the war might actually end. And these rumors create a strange psychological state where you're simultaneously hopeful and terrified, because if the war ends tomorrow and you die today, the cosmic injustice of that would be unbearable. The fighting continues right up until the last minute. Soldiers dying in attacks launched hours before the ceasefire takes effect. And there's something obscene about this, about officers ordering men to their deaths when everyone knows the war is ending. But orders are orders, and the killing continues until exactly 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, when the guns finally fall silent. The silence is shocking, physically disorienting, because you've been living with constant noise for so long that its absence feels unnatural, wrong, like the world is broken. Some soldiers cheer, some cry. Some just sit in stunned silence, unable to process that it's over, that they survived, that they don't have to fight anymore. The celebration is muted because you're looking around at the survivors and counting the absent, the friends who didn't make it, the men who died yesterday or last week or last year. And their absence hangs over the armistice like a shroud. The Germans emerge from their trenches too, and there's a surreal moment of non-hostility where you can see them as humans rather than enemies, and some units exchange cigarettes or food, while others just stare at each other across no man's land, too exhausted and damaged to feel anything. You're not going home immediately because the army needs to maintain order and occupation. So you spend weeks or months in France waiting for demobilization, living in slightly better conditions than the trenches, but still not free to leave, still subject to military discipline, still wearing the uniform and following orders. The transition from soldier to civilian is going to be difficult because you've changed in fundamental ways that make fitting back into normal society nearly impossible. And the people back home won't understand what you've been through and won't want to hear about it, even if you could find words to explain. Some men never successfully make this transition. They drift through civilian life like ghosts, unable to hold jobs or maintain relationships, haunted by memories and damaged by trauma that has no name and no treatment. The government promises to take care of veterans, pensions, and medical care and support. But these promises are inadequate to the scale of damage that's been done, and many veterans end up destitute or institutionalized or dead by their own hands because living with the memories proves harder than living through the experience. Coming home should be triumphant, but instead it's deeply alienating. Because the England you return to is fundamentally the same England you left. But you're fundamentally different. And this mismatch creates a sense of being a stranger in your own country, in your own family, in your own life. The crowds at the train stations wave flags and cheer for the returning soldiers, and politicians give speeches about heroism and sacrifice and the glorious victory. And none of this connects to your experience, because there was nothing glorious about watching your friends die in the mud. Nothing heroic about surviving through luck rather than courage. Your family welcomes you home with a mixture of relief and uncertainty because they can see you're not the same person who left. Something in your eyes has changed. Something in the way you carry yourself. And they don't know how to bridge this gap. They ask you questions about the war, and you give them sanitized answers because the truth would damage them. And anyway, they don't really want the truth. They want stories that confirm their beliefs about the war being necessary and worthwhile. You try to slot back into your old life, your old job if it still exists, your old routines, but nothing fits anymore. The rhythms of civilian life feel simultaneously too slow and too fast, too quiet and too loud. The silence at night is unbearable because you're used to artillery, and you find yourself unable to sleep without some kind of background noise. So you lie awake, listening to the nothing and remembering the something. Sudden noises make you flinch or dive for cover, your body reacting to stimuli that aren't there. And people look at you strangely when you drop to the ground because a car backfired. You can't stand crowds because too many people in close proximity triggers anxiety about gas attacks or artillery barrages. And you can't stand confined spaces because they remind you of dugouts and trenches. And you can't stand wide open spaces because they remind you of no man's land, where exposure meant death. Food tastes different, too rich or too bland. And you can't enjoy meals because you keep thinking about the men who are still hungry, who didn't make it home, who will never taste good food again. Relationships are difficult because intimacy requires vulnerability. And you've spent years building walls to protect yourself from feeling anything. And these walls don't come down just because the war is over. Some veterans find work and marriage, and manage to build lives that approximate normalcy, though the trauma never fully leaves. It just gets buried under layers of routine and repression. Others spiral downward, unable to hold jobs because they can't follow civilian authority after years of military discipline made them distrust all authority. Unable to maintain relationships because they're emotionally shut down. Turning to alcohol or drugs to numb the memories and the pain. The nightmares don't stop when the war ends. They just change location from the trenches to your bedroom. And some nights you wake up screaming or fighting invisible enemies, or so soaked in sweat that you have to change the sheets. And your wife or your mother tries to comfort you, but they can't because they weren't there. They don't understand what you're dreaming about, and you can't explain it to them. The dreams are vivid and specific. You're back in the trenches, and a shell is about to land on you. You're tangled in wire while machine guns fire. You're watching your friends die again and again and again, unable to save them, unable to look away. Sometimes you dream you're still there, and this civilian life is the dream. and you wake up relieved to be home, but also somehow disappointed because part of you is still in France, will always be in France, bound to that place by trauma and memory. During the day, you have flashbacks triggered by random things. The smell of cooking meat reminds you of burning bodies. Rain on a roof sounds like machine gun fire. Mud in a garden looks like the mud you lived in. And suddenly, you're not in England in 1920. You're back in the trenches in 1917, and your heart is racing, and you can't breathe. You learn to hide these episodes, to excuse yourself when you feel one coming, to find a private place where you can ride it out without witnesses. Because people don't understand, and their attempts to help just make it worse. The medical establishment has minimal understanding of what we now call PTSD. They still think shell shock is either a physical injury from blast concussion or a form of cowardice, and treatment is primitive at best. Rest cures that don't address the psychological damage, electric shock therapy that traumatizes further, institutionalization for the worst cases. Some veterans find ways to cope. They join veterans organizations where they can be around people who understand. They throw themselves into work or hobbies or causes. They self-medicate with alcohol, which creates its own problems, but at least provides temporary relief. Others never cope. They end up on the streets or in asylums or dead by suicide. And their families and society don't know how to help them because acknowledging the full extent of the psychological damage would mean acknowledging that the war destroyed not just bodies, but minds and souls. The government builds war memorials and holds remembrance ceremonies. But these public acknowledgments of loss don't translate into meaningful support for the living damaged. And there's a bitter irony in a society that honors dead soldiers while abandoning living veterans. You attend remembrance ceremonies because you feel obligated, standing with other veterans listening to speeches about sacrifice and duty. And part of you appreciates the acknowledgement while another part resents the sanitization, the way these ceremonies turn the horror into something noble and meaningful when it was neither of those things. It was just horror, period. The children born after the war grow up in the shadow of it. And if you become a father, you face the terrible question of what to tell your children about where you were and what you did. And the answer is usually nothing. Because how do you explain to a child that their father killed people? That their father saw things no human should see? That their father is fundamentally damaged in ways that affect how he parents and loves and exists in the world? Your children see your wounds, the physical ones if you have them, the missing limb, the scarred face, the lungs that don't work properly. And they accept these as facts of their father's body, but they can't see the psychological wounds, the rage that comes from nowhere, the depression that makes you withdraw for days, the hypervigilance that makes you overprotective to the point of suffocation. You try to be a good father, but the war has taken something from you that fathers need. Some capacity for lightness or playfulness or optimism about the future. And your children grow up sensing that something is wrong with dad, even if they can't articulate what. Some veterans overcompensate, becoming excessively strict disciplinarians who run their households like military units because that's the only mode they know. And their children grow up afraid of them, unable to connect with this damaged man who loves them but can't show it in ways they can recognize. Others go the opposite direction, becoming permissive to the point of neglect because after seeing real threats in the war, civilian dangers seem trivial. And why worry about your child falling from a tree when you've seen children killed by artillery. The relationship with your own father changes too. Because if he didn't serve, you resent him for not understanding. And if he served in an earlier war, you resent him for not warning you, for letting you walk into this with illusions intact. Your mother becomes someone you protect from the truth. You lie to her about being fine. You hide your struggles. You perform wellness because she's already lost so much to this war. Friends' sons, neighbors, the son she knew who was replaced by this damaged stranger. And you can't bear to add to her grief. Society expects you to move on, to be grateful you survived, to contribute productively to the rebuilding. And there's an impatience with veterans who can't or won't move on, who keep talking about the war or who struggle with civilian life. And this impatience creates pressure to hide your damage, to present a functioning facade even when you're barely holding together. The 1920s are called the Roaring Twenties, a decade of parties and prosperity and deliberate forgetting. And there's something obscene about society's eagerness to move on when so many men are still trapped in 1917 mentally, still fighting a war that everyone else wants to forget. The literature and art that comes out of the war captures some of the horror, the war poets, the novels, the paintings. But even these filtered versions are dismissed as unpatriotic or exaggerated by people who weren't there, who want to believe that the war was noble and meaningful, because acknowledging the truth would require confronting how many lives were wasted for nothing. Decades pass and the war becomes history, something that happened to someone else in another time. Except for you, it never becomes history because you're still living it every day in your damaged body and broken mind. And this creates a strange duality where you exist in two timelines simultaneously. The official timeline where it's 1940 or 1950 or 1960, and your personal timeline where it's always 1917 and you're always in the trenches. The Second World War happens, and you watch with a kind of sick recognition as the world does it all again, makes all the same mistakes, sends another generation to be traumatized and destroyed. And you want to warn them, but you know they won't listen because nobody listened to you. Nobody believed how bad it was. And now they're going to learn the same lessons the hard way. Some veterans serve again in World War II, driven by duty or unable to imagine any other life. And they bring the trauma of the First War into the Second, compounding damage upon damage. Others watch from home, too old or too damaged to serve, and they feel simultaneously relieved and guilty. Survivor's guilt extending across decades, across wars. Your friends from the trenches, the ones who survived, age alongside you, and you gather occasionally at reunions or remembrance events. And these gatherings are bittersweet because you're the only ones who truly understand what happened. But your numbers dwindle each year, men dying from old age or the long-term effects of gas exposure or trench foot complications, or just the cumulative wear of carrying trauma for 40 or 50 years. The world changes around you. Technology advances, society evolves. But the war remains frozen in your memory exactly as it was. And sometimes you catch yourself thinking in present tense about events that happened half a century ago because psychologically you never left. Part of you is still there and will always be there. Grandchildren are born and they ask about the war because they're studying it in school. And you finally have the distance to tell them something approximating the truth. Though you still edit, still soften. Because even now, the full horror is too much to share. You've lived long enough to see the war memorialized, romanticized, turned into movies and books that get it wrong in fundamental ways. And you alternate between wanting to correct the record and wanting to let the comfortable lies persist because maybe those lies are necessary for society to function. The physical evidence of the war fades. The trenches are filled in or preserved as tourist sites. The battlefields become farmland again. The cemeteries remain, but they're tended by people who never knew the men buried there. And you're one of the last living links to that reality. One of the few who can still say, I was there. This is what it was really like. Though fewer and fewer people are interested in listening to an old man's war stories, you realize you're going to die with most of your story untold because the things that matter most are the things you can't articulate. The moments between the battles, the small kindnesses and cruelties, the way it felt to be young and terrified and certain you were going to die. And these feelings don't translate into the narrative form that historians want. They exist in sense memory and emotion and in the permanent alteration of who you became. So now you understand why you wouldn't have lasted a day in the trenches of World War I. Not because you're weak or cowardly, but because those trenches were designed to break human beings, to exceed the limits of what minds and bodies can endure. And the fact that anyone survived at all is a testament not to heroism, but to the stubborn refusal of the human organism to die, even when death would be merciful. The soldiers who fought in that war weren't superhuman. They were just ordinary people subjected to extraordinary horror. And they coped by becoming numb, by dissociating, by building psychological walls that protected them in the moment, but crippled them for life. Your comfortable modern existence, with its clean water and adequate food and freedom from constant mortal terror, hasn't prepared you for the kind of suffering that was routine in the trenches. And that's actually a good thing. That's progress. That's what those soldiers were supposedly fighting for, even though most of them would tell you that they weren't fighting for anything except survival and the men beside them. The mythology that's built up around World War I, the poppies and the remembrance and the talk of sacrifice and glory, serves a purpose in helping society process the loss. But it also obscures the reality that the war was a catastrophic failure of leadership and imagination. That millions of men died for territorial gains that could be measured in yards. That the trauma inflicted on that generation rippled forward through their children and grandchildren in ways we're still understanding. If there's a lesson in all this horror, it's not about courage or duty or national pride. It's about the importance of questioning authority, of refusing to accept comfortable lies about war's necessity, of understanding that the men who send others to die are rarely the ones who pay the price. The veterans of World War I, the ones who survived physically and psychologically enough to leave testimony, tried to tell us this, tried to warn us that war destroys everyone it touches. But we didn't listen. We did it again in World War II and Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. And we'll probably do it again because forgetting is easier than learning. Because each new generation thinks their war will be different, cleaner, more justified. So when you look at your warm bed tonight, your full stomach, your intact body, your mind free from the constant expectation of violent death, be grateful not just for these comforts, but for the fact that you live in a time and place where you're not required to endure what those men endured. And if you're ever tempted to romanticize war or to think that combat is where boys become men or that there's glory in violence, remember the trenches. Remember the mud and the gas and the rats and the terror. Remember that the men who survived spent the rest of their lives trying to forget and understand that the real courage isn't in fighting wars, but in refusing to send others to fight them. The last veterans of World War I are gone now, the final living witnesses to that particular nightmare. And with them went the unmediated truth of what it was really like. And all we have left are the memorials and the histories and the fading photographs of young men who had no idea what they were walking into and who paid for that ignorance with their bodies and minds and futures. And the least we can do is remember them honestly, without the comfortable distance of mythology, as human beings who suffered beyond measure in a war that should never have happened.